Okay, I'm live. Really appreciate being able to do this interview today with James. I'm just going to be bringing him on here in a minute. But before I do, I just wanted to say as well, not only is it great to see people like James contributing to social media and with such great language and describing the kind of situation we find ourselves in today. And like I say, I'm really appreciative to have him on the show. But there's another one. I'm looking to have a follow-up conversation with someone else too. Another lady. You folks are probably well aware of that lady. That was the retired. I believe she's a teacher or a librarian. Someone there in, I believe it was Waterloo, and she's won her court case in terms of how that whole situation played out over the Zoom call. But anyways, like I say, I'll get to that a little bit further on. But for now, I'm going to bring on Jason here, and I'm going to allow him to introduce himself and give some background and just kind of go from there.
Hey, everybody.
How you doing, Jason?
I'm good, man. Thanks for having me, Bennett. This is pretty cool, man. I appreciate you having me on your show, man. This is awesome.
Oh, well, listen, as soon as I saw your post on Twitter, or should I say X, formerly known as Twitter, I was really, really impressed, to be honest with you, because as we all know, there's a lot of people out there that are taking stances, memes. Hey, I'm guilty of sharing a meme or two myself from time to time, but it's kind of rare and the exception for people to put such nuanced thought and articulate them in such a way that you did on your post on X. And kudos to you for doing that, because I firmly believe that's kind of the way things have to go. You need the people that are more reasonable, not playing the one-upsmanship or the left versus right, right? The whole tribalism thing, but people just speaking to these kind of issues from the heart and mind as well. So like I said, just if you wouldn't mind taking a moment just to give yourself a little introduction for the people that maybe aren't familiar with you, although I'm sure after, what was it, just the last time I freshed, I think you're well over anyways now 250,000 views on Twitter. So I'm sure lots of people are familiar, but at least give some of the folks that maybe haven't got a chance to see it yet a little background as to not just who you are, but what caused you, what enticed you to put forth such a post in the first place.
Yeah, okay. Well, I'm a writer. I'm an essayist. I guess that's what you call it. I don't know. I just write my thoughts down. And I host the Brave New Normal podcast. So I'm technically a podcaster now too. And yeah, I've been writing for 23 years in some capacity or another. I'm a former columnist. I wrote guest editorials for a number of publications, and I stopped for a really long time because of what I saw happening in politics and just the way politics was affecting my profession and what I do. And so I stopped. I got a regular job, did that for a number of years, and I came back to it at the beginning of the pandemic because I just felt like there was a lot of questionable things happening, and voices were going to be required. So I just started writing down my observations, and I'm a student of history. I've spent most of my life reading history. I recognized a lot of what was happening early on. I mean, even before the pandemic, I recognized what was going on when woke first arrived. I recognized it as a cultural revolution almost immediately because it almost perfectly mirrors Mao's cultural revolution and the way that it took shape. So of course I was alarmed. I was freaked out. I think just as most other people were who could recognize what was happening. And yeah, so I started my Substack. I started the first iteration of my podcast, which was fun, but I just I took a break from that because I really felt like writing was where I needed to be. So I was doing that, and then over time my X account just grew and grew and grew, and my following grew, and I was, everything that I was putting out. It's kind of strange because most people, their podcasts or their videos or whatever they share tend to be the things that get the most attention. But for me, it was long form writing. The longer my essays, the more reads I was getting. So, a lot of my essays have 250,000 to 1 million reads on X, and my Substack, of course, is in the same territory. So, right. So yeah, here I am, man. I'm kind of just going with the wind, right?
Well, I got to say, when you're talking about that, it actually gives me a little bit of hope, and for not just now, but for the future, by simple fact that a lot of us, young or old, I'm a Gen Xer, but even back when I was younger and as I grown up, it seemed that everything was like snippets and sound bites to the point where most people's attention span doesn't last very long. But you've recognized, am quite impressed by the sheer fact, and it tells me that people really genuinely do. There is a market out there for an actual long form, whether it's in writing, such as what you do, or in podcast form. Well, I guess we both do that as well, so that people get that, because those 5-minute segments or snippets, from your typical establishment media outlets, it doesn't, it's good if you just want to feed people who are like ideologically driven from that left-right thing, right? You just throwing up the, go Leafs go, basically, right?
Yeah.
Right. But once again, that doesn't do anything to actually get people thinking critically or properly about the kind of issues that are facing us. And that is what I found to be not just inspiring, but quite impressive to see, that there are a growing number of people, not just in Canada, but in the entire Western world, from what I've seen and gathered, that are really not just willing, but excited and seemingly chomping at the bit to have access to these kinds of long-form discussions or long-form articles. So that, I suppose, to them, I'm just kind of projecting my own thoughts on this, but for me in particular, what it is yes, I don't want to just know that you're picking a side in this thing. I want to know that you have actually taken the time to think about all areas and aspects of this particular subject matter, and you're willing to come to the conversation and put forth a good faith argument. And that's what I see you did in your article. There was no slants, there was no slight, there was no digging at the opponent. It was basically pointing out what you yourself have observed. And once again, you're definitely not alone in that. And I'm happy to see there are a lot of people that are coming around to think about this. But my first question off the top of my head would be, first of all, how old are you?
I'm 40.
So you're 40. Okay. So in your own personal life, whether it's in your work life, your social life, have you noticed yourself a difference between now, let's say within the last couple of years, and maybe 5-10 years ago, if this is something that was even on your radar, in terms of the kind of people, like I say, whether it's people in your community, family members, friends, that are starting to kind of shift, or at least be more willing to listen to or engage in conversation or dialogue? Or are you finding it still predominantly the same old, the people that just don't want to, plug their ears, close their eyes, right, and just don't want to hear anything that they're not, it doesn't align with their ideology or their preferences?
Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, I've noticed a complete shift, and I think it speaks to my popularity as a writer, because I'm blown away by how many people read my long form pieces, because it's hard, as you said, to keep anybody's attention for more than 20 or 30 seconds. It's amazing that I'm holding people's attention for a 5 to 15 minute read. But I think what it boils down to is I think people are hungry for truth. I think that's what it is. I think coming out of the circumstance or the scenario that we just went through with the pandemic, we're in a strange place where the world as we know it isn't real anymore. We've been lied to so thoroughly and so often, and our institutions have been so corrupted that I think people are just hungry to hear truth. And I think we instinctually recognize truth when we see it. And I think that's kind of the void that I've filled, is that I'm not a journalist. I don't write, really dry essays that's just fact. Everything I'm writing is opinion, right? It's just my observations. But I think that's what people want to hear, because I think a lot of people feel alone. I think a lot of people think that they're the only ones who see what they see. And I think that's why people have connected to what I'm writing, is because I think it helps them to know that somebody out there sees it too. And when they see the engagement that my posts are getting, they're reaffirmed in knowing that there's hundreds of thousands of other people who also see it. So in terms of the conversation, yeah, it's totally shifted. I mean, the idea of the World Economic Forum and globalism was a conspiracy theory until February 14th, 2022. And
Right.
the crazy thing to me was that I would talk to people about it, and again, they would say, "Oh, it's a conspiracy theory," and I'd say, well, "Have you read the book?" Because I did. I read The Great Reset. They laid it all out there. I think that book was written, from a place of arrogance and thinking that people wouldn't recognize what they were reading. I recognized it immediately. And
A lot of hubris, for sure.
Yeah. And so, long answer short, yeah, I think we've totally shifted. I think we've reached a place where we are experiencing a great awakening. I think people who typically follow the mainstream narrative are breaking away because there's power in numbers. And when people see that, tens, hundreds of thousands, millions of people are waking up, it encourages them to do the same because they know that they're not the only one. They're not crazy. And I think that's what's been the driving factor behind the conversation shifting back toward reality. Actually,
you mentioned that it seemed that the world isn't real anymore. And for me, and I suppose with you being 40 years old, that is a reality. And for sure, that's something that a lot of us in Canada have noticed, this shift. And it's undeniable for people who are actually being observant. My question, though, I always wonder, and I try to do these thought experiments where I put myself into the shoes of many different other people. And what I think of today is, of course, that would be based on what you would have considered quite normal historically in terms of your lifeline, like in terms of your timeline that you've been on this earth. But I always wonder and question, what about the younger people today? And that's really, because obviously they are the future, right? And that's what I am constantly curious and inquisitive about is, people can become quite comfortable and familiar and are quite malleable and can adapt to some pretty crazy shit. So I worry about the younger folks today that actually, seemingly for most of their life so far, this kind of nonsense is their reality, right? And I really worry about that because, like I say, now I also recognize that as people get older, hopefully most of them will shake off that and realize that, okay, yeah, just like, when your parents told you that Santa was real, okay, that wasn't legit, right? Hopefully something will spark their mind and start to question some of these things as well. But what we're seeing today, and now it's nice to see the pushback, but there seems to be a very well-established and entrenched body of people. Now, sure, they might represent a minority of people in terms of the population of this country, but they seem very, very well entrenched throughout all of the main institutions and even the cultural drivers in the Western countries. So, once again, my question to you would be in terms of regarding that is, do you have hope or faith that the younger people today are going to be able to recognize and perceive what you and I are seeing?
Yeah, well, I'm seeing that change. I'm seeing that change quite a bit. My son's 12 years old. Excellent. And I see an overwhelming rejection of wokeism amongst him and his friend group, and I'm seeing that amongst younger people because I think they know they've been hoodwinked, right. And they're waking up to it just like everybody else is. But I think the responsibility in educating the younger generation is on us. I think it's our responsibility. Yes. I think we have to take accountability for the future. And so, that's part of why I'm writing the stuff that I'm writing is because I know that there's a lot of young people paying attention. I think young people specifically, the younger millennial generation, they're confused just like everyone else is. I mean, imagine being, a teenager during a time where your government and special interest groups are telling you that not only is it okay to chop off your sex organs, but that your public profile and your popularity will increase as a result of doing so. Look, there's something intrinsically evil in this cultural revolution that we've experienced. And I'm actually writing about an essay about, I was writing literally until we started talking about this, but I think there's something inside of us that tells us what's going on is wrong, right? Like we have that human instinct, and we're not seeing a right-left divide. I think that's the main misconception about our cultural chaos. It's not a right-left divide. It's a matter of the way people are responding to the fight or flight response. Right. And there's people like you and I'm traditionally from the left. I was on the left for years until around, 2010. Now I find myself occupying a more libertarian space politically with my own set of values. And I think more people find themselves there because they're realizing that, no, this isn't about liberal or conservative. What this boils down to is, are you going to fight or are you going to join them? Are you going to fight? It's fight or flight. Are you going to fight back knowing, are you going to listen to your heart knowing what's going on is deeply insidious and sinister? Or are you just going to succumb to it? And I think that's the cultural divide we're experiencing, is that it's people who are willing to fight versus people who are too cowardly and too afraid.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that you come from the left, because that is something even myself, but I've come to realize through a lot of reading myself and learning, and my mind evolving over the years, actually more than a decade now. But I myself would have considered when I was younger that I was liberal too, but at that time, of course, I didn't have a whole lot of influence in terms of explaining politics to me, so I kind of had, like I said, had to figure this out on my own. But it was never set up to me when I was younger, growing up. I don't remember even the concept of the left versus right. It just, to me, a liberal was someone that just had the live, let live kind of mentality, right? That was the whole point. When I was growing up, it was typically, in my age anyways, when I was growing up, is typically the ones that were the busybodies, or trying to suppress speech, or trying to, be busybodies in the bedroom kind of a thing, right? Where the conservatives, the ultra right wing, as they call them, the conservatives. And I find it absolutely strange and just such a weird dichotomy to see that it's today people who actually, and they still call themselves liberal. It'd be different if they only identified as a progressive or a leftist. But these are people who are calling themselves, label themselves liberal. And once again, I just can't help but point out that in the age of information, you don't even need a physical dictionary to find out what a liberal is. You just have to type that into any search bar and you'll find out. And then if you look at it, it's like, well, wait a minute. The reality is just not matching with the rhetoric here. If you're a liberal, well, what's this whole idea of now you're trying to suppress speech or invoke emergency act to silence and quash peaceful protest? I mean, there's nothing that I've seen from those who identify as liberal, and that's mostly in the political and the media class. And I guess I could include people who are liberal supporters. Is it that they're just not paying enough attention? They're just listening to the taglines and still playing the whole liberal thing? Because I have to believe myself that a lot of the people, whether they're tacitly or anxiously going along with this stuff, is if they actually knew, if they had things spelled out to them properly, rather than everything, like I say, politicized and propagandized, and the language so heavily manipulated and skewed that they don't even really know what's going on. That's I think what's most disturbing to me is we live in the age of information, but people don't seem to have the capacity to even just go along with what are the defined meanings of the words that we use, and then acknowledge that, okay, a liberal doesn't seem very liberal these days, right?
Yeah, well, I think it's intellectual laziness, right? I wrote years ago, and I stand by this. Ideology provides easy answers to complex questions for people who don't want to think, right? And that's really what it boils down to. Look, what we're seeing on the left is not liberalism; that's anti-liberalism, right? It's not liberalism; it's left to the extreme. If you think about the political spectrum, it's actually a circle, right? And when you get to the extremes, fascism and communism are identical to each other. Right. And they just have different, I guess, ideological tenets, right? But it's the same in essence, and that's where they found themselves. It's illiberalism. Look, the real liberals, I say this, there's two classes of liberals. There's the yellow-bellied, tuck tail and hide liberals, which are most of the people occupying the left now. And then there's renegade liberals like me. Right. And again, I find myself being more of a libertarian, even kind of drifting a little bit more towards conservatism now. But if you put my political ethics and values on paper and you shoved them into Google, you would get liberal. Right. It's just I'm not a capital L liberal. I've never actually voted for the Liberal Party in my life. That's one thing I can take comfort in saying. But yeah, I think, with my generation, we're finding ourselves. I think libertarianism has become way more appealing to people my age over the last 5 to 10 years, right? And I think that's the space most people find themselves in now.
Yeah, well, that's for me in particular when I started learning about libertarian. And then I'll just point this out too. Being from the East Coast, and predominantly the East Coast is primarily populated, so the most of the folks that would have come from Europe and settled in New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and PEI, well, even the names of the countries kind of give you a clue to that, right? So typically English and French or Irish or Scottish. And libertarian philosophy, as far as I'm concerned, the thing that I found which was striking and it's so amazing about it is it actually it somewhat aligns with liberalism, but I think where liberalism fails or doesn't complete the story, that's where the philosophy of liberty and libertarians, which predominantly, I guess, if you go back historically, a lot of them, their heritage or history in terms of their European ancestors would have been German, Austrian descent type folks, right? So I see where, maybe a lot of people, depending on your jurisdiction in the country, you might not have even been familiar or know what libertarianism is, what the philosophy of liberty entails. And this is all stuff that people learn post the Enlightenment era. And like I say, which is why you can include even English or Scottish figures like your John Locke's and your Adam Smiths with your Hayeks and your Mises and your Hayeks as well. But the thing about what I think of, especially for young people in particular, and why I think that, and I've said this multiple times, is libertarian, the philosophy of liberty, it is the future. I don't believe it's going to be liberal or conservative or any iteration of collectivism. If humanity is going to progress or advance the way we really should be, and getting out of our teen years and actually becoming adults in terms of learning what freedom is all about, is the philosophy of liberty, because not only does it have the three core principles, which is self-ownership, I own me, nobody gets to claim ownership of me, property rights, and that entails anything that I produce or provide. Nobody gets to claim any higher ownership over the things that I produce and provide with my labor or my intellect. And of course, the last and I think really one of the most important key aspects is the non-aggression principle, because this is the kind of thing that most of us, I would say almost every one of us, with very rare exceptions, as children, even if we didn't have it jammed into our head from our parents or from some authority, even just socializing out in the playground, realize that, don't hit, don't steal, right? Those kind of things, don't use violence, theft, coercion. So to me, and those are really three things. It doesn't take a whole lot to explain it, but it does, because the absence of the problem with liberalism, it doesn't complete it of what you as a person should do in terms of, in social or economic settings. So the non-aggression principle is a great thing. So you don't have to combat it from the religious aspect. That was something that actually Christianity filled that void quite well. And I've even found myself very much aligned with a lot of Christian thinkers. And because I firmly believe that, Christianity in terms of the ethics, or most of them, especially I'm talking mostly from the New Testament, and then free market capitalism, I think those two things together are completely conducive with not just each other, but really genuinely are the basis and the foundation for a truly prosperous, flourishing, and a peaceful society. And to me, that's really what libertarian and the philosophy of liberty entails, is if we're going to get that way in the future, then people, and in particular young people, need to get to the full and firm understanding is we have to truly, genuinely treat each other with voluntary means and actions. And we actually have all the modern amenities and technology to do so. Historically, force might have been, a means to an end. And I don't say I'm excusing it, but you can see how the case was made historically, right? But today we live, like I say, in the 21st century, and we have to evolve. And I've kind of coined my own little phrase. I call it the Enlightenment era. I think we're going through right now the Enlightenment era 2.0. And that's the area we're at. And people like yourself are greatly contributing to that. And it's so nice to see and to hear as well that you have a 12-year-old son. Not that, once again, I don't recommend or advocate for you, get your child into too heavily deep into philosophy or politics, but obviously he or she is living in the real world. So when confronted with these situations or circumstances, it is really paramount importance to have people like you, a father like yourself, that's willing to arm him with the tools and the knowledge to defend his stance, his position, because I am a firm believer, because I've witnessed it, and I'm an anecdotal experience myself to see, is if you're that one person, regardless of your age, that's willing to speak up and offer a counter opinion or a perspective, that emboldens, like you were kind of alluding to earlier, others to, even if they're not speaking up themselves, to at least digest and dissolve some of that stuff, so that they're thinking more critically about these issues. So kudos to you. Kudos to you teaching these things to your son. And I just wanted to get a little more thought on actually getting back to your letter here, or the big note that you wrote. So when you were saying basically it was the woke is end, so I would assume based on that you firmly believe that Trudeau and the woke type of mob in Canada are at the very least at the precipice of being on their way out. Would that be an accurate assessment?
Yeah. Well, there's a big set. There's two parts to that, right?
Okay. Yep.
I think culturally woke died the day that they invoked the Emergencies Act, and I think it was because the world got to see where that philosophy leads. And I'll argue that forever. I think that was when they froze bank accounts and assets. I think people in Canada, because we tend to be fairly disconnected and apathetic, a lot of the mainstream Canadians, they don't understand the ramifications that it had throughout the world, right? There's a ripple effect that's still reverberating across the planet, right? And I think you can attribute, well, you can definitely attribute what happened in Holland with the farmer protests to the Canadian truckers, but you can attribute Javier Milei's rise in Argentina. I think you can connect that to the Freedom Convoy in Canada. You can definitely connect the rejection of wokeism in the United States, a lot of what's going on now, to what happened in Canada. Because when you take people's livelihoods, right, that is essential to who we are as human beings. And when you clamp down and you take that from people, or you play with it in any way, it terrifies people. And I think Trudeau and the federal Liberals, as it relates to the Canadian milieu, right, they're long gone. I don't know a human being who has any belief or faith in this government whatsoever. I really don't. And if when you go on X, you see people who are hardcore, Trudeau supporters, but I don't think those people are real. I don't think those people actually exist. I think most of those are bots. I would be very, very surprised if there's even 1% of our country who are still firmly behind Trudeau and the federal Liberal government. Even hardcore Liberals know that this is not a Liberal government. This is an illiberal government. However, I think that there is an agenda that Trudeau and this Liberal government serves, and I think that the people pulling the levers behind that agenda are determined to keep Trudeau and the Liberals in power for as long as they need, because I don't think Pierre Poilievre is willing to play ball with them. At least everything that he's let us in on so far, right? I don't think he's going to play ball with them. Our next option, Maxime Bernier, there's no way he's playing ball. So I think that there's no realistic successor to Justin Trudeau. And so the agenda that he serves is determined to keep him in power. I mean, let's be honest here. The amount of just, I don't want to say hate, but it's the only word that comes to mind. The amount of hate that he has received from Canadians. I mean, who else, even him, would want to stay doing that job, knowing how deeply despised he is by his own country, right? Like, it doesn't make sense. And that's the part that I've been toiling with in my mind, is why is he still even doing it? Anybody else would have stepped down a long time ago. But I think there is a much larger conspiracy at work. And I think that is the agenda Trudeau serves. And I think whatever goodies, whatever treasure is at the end of the rainbow for him is on the line if he doesn't continue on and press forward. And I think that's really what we're seeing a gigantic disconnect between the Canadian population and our federal government, and the gap widens every single day. And I just don't think he's going to go until he's told it's time to go.
Yeah. Well, I got to tell you, when you and that word gets tossed around a lot, but even when you talk about the word conspiracy, I just can't help but think, because like I put a lot of thought in this stuff over the years, and when you see it's, I typically like to attribute this stuff not to malice, but to ignorance, incompetence, and a lot of stuff. My issue that I've been taking, and the more this goes on, the more it solidifies my thoughts on this whole thing, is it almost seems malicious and like with really, really bad intentions underlying it. Because I just can't help but like I've said this before. I don't know if you ever heard me say this, but when people talk about right-wing authoritarians, which obviously there are such things and they exist and they have existed in the past. But what I would acknowledge, and whether you're talking about just from watching movies, music, or listening to music or anything, the right winger, or let's just think about a movie, right? Your typical right winger. To me, that stands to me as the kind of person that is unapologetic in their conviction and the fact that they are willing to do bad, terrible things to people who they perceive as their opponents. What I find so nefarious and just scummy and just degenerate almost in the way this whole thing is done is these people who claim to be progressives or liberals as such are using people that would be typically identified as minority groups or from victim type classes, right? And that to me I find extremely nefarious and like you were kind of saying, almost evil in nature, the fact that you're hiding behind this false pretense that you're doing it on behalf of these people. But I just can't help but see, and I'm sure you've acknowledged it yourself, is some of the people that are being used as these human shields for these collectivists, for these authoritarians to put forth their rhetoric and their agenda, are the people I think at the end of the day are going to really suffer the most under these kind of scenarios.
Yeah, well, you referenced Mao. So at the beginning of the Great Leap Forward, at the beginning of the communist takeover in China, they relied heavily on peasant uprisings, right? That was really what gave them their foothold on Chinese culture, right? It was that the nationalists, they hadn't done a great job of taking care of the peasant class, and so communism came around, and they were able to rouse the interests of the peasants and through that. And it was 5-10 years later after the initial peasant uprisings that they were living on. I mean this when I say that they were eating dirt. They were eating leaves off of trees. They were starving to death. Over 70 million people died in Mao's China, right? And so, yeah, that's always been a radical leftist a tactic, right? Is to collectivize the underclasses and fight them or pit them against the perceived bourgeoisie, right? That's Marxism in a nutshell. But what they never understand is that just by nature, that radical leftism or communism, it takes full advantage of the underclasses and the peasantry. And I think communism has been applied over 60 times throughout history. It's never been successful, and the reason for it being is because, as I wrote in the essay that we were talking about earlier, Marxism is deception is a prerequisite for the application of Marxism, right? Because if people realize that they're going to be used for their labor and starved to death, oligarchies naturally form in these systems, right? Because it's just part of human nature. We're shitty by nature. I always say that to people. We are human beings. We are shitty by nature. That's why the two main political philosophies exist, right? You have liberalism, which is more centered around social issues, and then you have conservatism, which is more centered around fiscal issues. And those two philosophies have to exist in balance with one another in order to have a productive society. And now you have the emergence of libertarianism, which has always been around, but is more prevalent now because libertarianism plays the most important role. It is the guard against corruption. Right. The political philosophy of libertarianism, in essence, guards against the ugliness that can potentially come out of both political philosophies when they radicalize.
Right. Yes.
Right. And so that's the importance of libertarianism. Putting liberty and freedom as the top priority above all else. Right. Personal, individual liberty and freedom. And so, Yeah, I mean, I forgot the original question where I was, where what you
Well,
asked.
actually, it's okay because actually, I was actually just thinking of another question off the top of my head there because it was part way down, I think about a quarter of the way down in your article, and I'd like to get your thoughts more on the. Of course, we could go back to read it, but I'd rather just get you to kind of freewheel with your thoughts on the whole thing, like with the modern the third wave feminism thing coming into the lexicon, right? Because that's another one where I find it's such a strange thing, because as far as I was concerned, once again, growing up, I was quite familiar that, historically there were times when women were treated as second class citizens, right? Just like some races in the past, right? Might have been. And to me, I was completely on board as a Gen Xer growing up. And actually, I'll point this out too, is none of this stuff was ever jammed. This is another thing that I find so strange. All of these things were issues that were brought to the forefront while I was growing up, covered extensively in a lot of the cultural drivers such as movie, music, and television. But because it was done without, people, without seemingly an underlying agenda other than to create actual equality under the law, is and like I say, the supporting cultural drivers such as movies, it wasn't so in your face. It would just show, an example of people maybe talk and get along with each other, and then you would just find out after the fact that maybe one was gay or this. And that, for me, growing up, didn't have to go through any political science degrees, didn't have to study up on philosophy or politics or any of that stuff. It just resonated with me and with most of my peers that, yeah, of course, you just treat people with dignity and respect. You're just continuing on the kind of things that you were supposed to learn as a child. But why is it, which I find so strange, right, is where did this third wave feminism thing, what caused so much disgruntledness? Because as far as I'm concerned, women have been seemingly doing quite well. I've covered it myself in the past. It's very hard to get the numbers, but Neil McDonald, he used to be a contributor to the CBC. I remember it was a CBC article probably 5 or 6 years ago, and at that time, Canada's public sector workforce, which people that make really good money typically and higher even more so than in the private sector in a lot of areas, were comprised and made up of 71% of women. And I even personally, in my own anecdotal experience and people that I know, I've witnessed and observed a lot of women, single, married, or anywhere in between, that have seemingly done a whole lot better and have had a tremendous amount of opportunities for them. So I just find it strange, and I wonder what was the underlying cause. What was the precipice that caused this third wave feminism thing to go so off the rails from what was historically what I understood what feminism was? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, to understand third wave feminism, you have to understand first and second wave feminism, right? So, right. And just to summarize, first wave feminism, was developed in the 1960s, the women's liberation movement, and there's a lot of questionable motives and actions around that time. It is there. The CIA was involved in that movement to a degree, and I think the ambition was to get women into the workforce and to make America's economy stronger. A lot of people suggest that it was to break up the family. I don't know if that was the intentional.
Well,
if that was the intent.
You can't tax housework. I suppose that would have been one of the.
Well, that's basically it. The goal was to get women into the workforce. However, the first wave feminists did have a very real argument in a lot of circumstances, right? I mean, women were, coming out of the 1940s and the 1950s, they were considered second-class citizens in a lot of ways, right? Now, again, it's like how much of that is gender role and how much of that is actual oppression, I don't know, right? Because I'm married, and in my home, my wife and I, we tend to fit well within our gender roles as they've traditionally been. But second, so that's first wave feminism. First wave feminism did a lot for women's rights. Second wave feminism appears 1980s, 1990s, and it's a much softer feminism, right? It's the feminism that gave us women like Christina Hoff Sommers and Naomi Wolf, these incredibly educated, brilliant women
Mm.
who, you know, it wasn't as much of a rough around the edges hard stance as first wave feminism, right? Third wave feminism basically is an outgrowth of second wave feminism with neo-Marxist postmodernism applied. So essentially what it did was it took the ideas of second wave feminism and radicalized them. And what it did was it put women on, I always explain it as a grid, and postmodern the critical theories, the postmodern have a postmodern intersectional grid, right, where everybody exists along this oppression grid, and at the very, very top are straight white men, and at the very, very bottom are, well, apply as many, you know, victim statuses as you possibly can, and that's the bottom. And what third wave feminism did was it put women on that grid, and it said that, you know, women as a gender are you know, historically oppressed, and through that created this radicalized version of feminism that really didn't make any sense. And you know, and I think people picked up on it pretty quickly, right? But you know, you had campaigns like Me Too and Time's Up and things like that, which again I think were great because it brought to light a lot of you know, sexual abuses that women had suffered over the years, a lot of times in silence for fear of what society would think of them, you know, because there is that perception of being damaged goods if a woman has been raped or if a woman has been sexually abused. And it did a lot to bring to light how prevalent that actually is in our society and in our culture. But because it was a radical theory, it took things to the extreme, and that was its undoing and its failure.
Yeah, well, you know, now that you mention that, when I think about the whole with the second and the third wave thing, I'm just going to spitball off my head and let me know what you think of this. So I think, like I say, I'm using my own personal observation. I haven't done no big study on this, so once again, it's just me throwing out my thoughts here. But me personally, I see a divide in particular from my parents' generation, the boomers, and from my generation, the women. And where I see the divide predominantly now is not even necessarily along, you know, racial lines or, well, maybe to a degree socioeconomic status. But the main factor seems to me is the ones who are the loudest, most vocal, and seemingly disgruntled feminists, these third wave feminists with so many grievances. But it seems to me, and the ones that are constantly pointing out the patriarchy and oppression, all that stuff, predominantly seem to come from the public sector or are associated with the government in some form or fashion. Like, whereas people like my wife and other women that my wife hangs out or associates with that are predominantly from the private sector, completely at odds with that kind of line of reasoning and thinking. And I can't help but think, because we humans are very susceptible, I've done it myself, I'm sure we all have, are quite apt at projecting our own biases, our own feelings and emotions onto others, right? And I can't help but think all these people that are talking about the systemic racism and all of the, they forego, basically they listen to their thought leaders at the time, and they forego the traditional way that humans, you know, thrive and survive, right? And the nuclear family and stuff like that. And they went into, you know, put off, postponed, or maybe didn't even bother having kids. They went into these professional positions. And I suppose, you know, enough time has gone by, you know, they were promised a utopia and found that actually it's quite dystopian, right? And I would imagine the political angst and infighting and grievances and, it could be just, I could imagine the toxic type of environment, which is why they constantly talk about these things and why people like you or I or so many others are like, well, wait a minute. I've never observed this world, this realm that you claim that exists, and it surrounds me entirely. And it probably has something to do with the fact of where I am and my perspective and theirs. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, look, there's something to be said for the traditional North American family structure, right? You know, if you go to non-Western nations, that family structure still very much exists, you know, and I mean, even and I hate to paint it out this way, but it's the truth, you know, like my wife is Filipina, she's Canadian, she's born and raised here, right? But but they have but they have traditions, they have cultural traditions, and
Mm.
part of those cultural traditions are the traditional family structure, and our home is very, very balanced because of that. Right now, yeah, she works full time, and there are some compromises made in that structure. Like, I do a lot of the cooking in the house because I like to cook and I'm a good cook, right?
Yeah.
It is, you know what I mean? But in terms of just the roles that men and women play in the home, our home exists typically in that traditional manner. Now, you know, I mean, yeah, I don't know what the motivating factors were behind all of it, but you can see the chaos that it's caused, right? And and you know, I remember when third wave feminism really kind of entered the public consciousness and young women were gravitating toward it. I saw immediately the type of young women that were captured by it, and it was young women who, look, if you tell somebody that they're a victim, right? There are certain personalities and types of people that are going to gravitate toward victimhood, because what victimhood does is it removes accountability, right? It removes your own self responsibility for yourself. So these young women that were telling my wife that she was a slave and that she was being oppressed by me, they were all the same type of person, right? They were all single women without children who couldn't keep a healthy relationship going for more than a week. And so, yeah, of course, it became very convenient for them to become victims all of a sudden, right? Because it removed all accountability from their lives. They didn't have to be accountable for themselves. The reason why they were in the situation they were in was because of the patriarchy, because men were oppressing them, because they couldn't just do what they wanted without any repercussions, right? And you know, you find a lot of those women in the public sector, right? And there were a lot of women like my wife who were like not okay with it, but it was because my wife was comfortable. My wife likes being a mom. She likes being a wife. You know what I mean? And I think that there's a lot of women who fit that category as well. It's just, again, it really, what it boils down to, it's not just third wave feminism. It boils down to all of the critical theories, whether it's critical race theory or queer theory. You end up with two camps. You end up with the people who want to be victims. They want excuses made for them so that they don't have to take accountability for their own lives. And then you have everybody else, and everybody else tends to find themselves outside of that ideology, which is, you know, where you and I sit and why we're talking to each other today. It's pretty cut and dry that way, right? Like, anybody who's okay with being a victim is anybody who doesn't want to take responsibility for their own life.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And that's definitely the kind of things that I've instilled in both of my sons, and I hope they continue to do that for their children once they have them. Because yes, that constant externalizing, and that's not even myself. Like, you know, I've been through some pretty rough times in my life. You know, I could easily, I have a list long enough that I could say, here's all the things that happened to me, and here now I'm just going to claim victim status and externalize all my grievances. But what I have found is it's just soul crushing to any human being that undertakes that kind of victim mentality. And I just can't imagine why anyone would want to fill their head with that kind of nonsense, to the point where you've created your own barriers and walls. They talk about people like, oh, there's this glass ceiling. No, there's not a ceiling at all, other than the limitations that you placed on yourself. Because once again, I have yet to meet any human being, and I've known a lot of people over the course of my life. I've lived in multiple jurisdictions, and like I said, hung out with all different kinds of people, rural type people, big urban centers. And every human being, bar none, that I've ever met, have been through some kind of a difficult time in their life. You know, some more than others, no doubt. But what defines you as a person, as a human being, is how you can handle and deal with those situations. Now, I can understand for a short time frame or a period where people might get into that kind of mentality, right? But what I don't understand is there none of these people that we're hearing, these vocal proponents of this victim cult, is there genuinely nobody, and I can't help but believe it must be the case, is there nobody in their life, not one single person in their life, that can help maybe hold up a mirror, or maybe, you know, have these kinds of discussion with them, so that they're not going to live? Because not only are they a detriment to the rest of society by sheer fact that they're using the power of politics and the state as a means to, you know, batter their opponents or embody their ideologies into so many institutions, but they're gravely harming themselves. That's the thing. To me, it's one thing you can understand when people want to externalize or cause harm to other people, but this constant notion where you want to do so much self-harm, because the victim cult, the victim mentality, I mean, that's got to be one of the most harmful thing a person can do to themselves. And to me, I can't imagine how this is held for so long, other than the sheer fact that there doesn't seem to be anyone in these people's lives are trying to help them work through these situations. So part of me kind of feels bad for them. And I would like to, if it wasn't for the sheer fact that they're constantly trying to wreak so much havoc in society. And I suppose that's probably applicable or attributable to the old saying that misery loves company.
Yeah, well, it's by design, right? That's the part that people have to get, that people have to understand. It's by design, right? When you create victims, you create dependents, right? And look, I'm Métis. My mother is Plains Cree Indian, right? Look at the First Nations community in Canada, right? That is a group that has been routinely and repeatedly victimized and told that they're victims. And a lot of those communities are dependent on the government for survival. Well, that's the same thing they're trying to do to everybody. They're trying to create victims, because when you create a victim, you create a dependent. And when you create a dependent, you create somebody that you can control. And that's essentially what they're trying to do. They're trying to put everybody on the reservation. Right. And that's why no matter what, look, we're all human. We all have challenges. We all have things about ourselves that are we're all flawed. But if you're told, if you can turn your flaw into some sort of victim status, and you don't want to take accountability for yourself, then perfect. That's great for you, right? And that's why you have all of these different branches of the same neo-Marxist postmodern cult, because no matter who you are, you'll fit somewhere in there. Right. And so you too can be a victim. You can embrace victimhood. And once you become a victim, then you become a dependent, and you become dependent on your government. And I don't think it's any coincidence that we're seeing ideas like universal basic income tossed around. Right. Well, look, if you're a victim and you're useless to the world, you don't have any value, then universal basic income makes total sense. Right. But for people like you and I, who are, we take accountability for ourselves. We're men. We take care of our business. We don't want a universal basic income because we don't want to be slaves. We're not dependents, right? So that's really what it boils down to. It's by design. This entire cultural revolution was introduced to North America via China by design to destroy our economy, to destroy our cultures, and to destroy our traditions, and to destroy the things that hold us together.
Right. Well, it's funny that you mentioned that, because I automatically get the mental image of that meme, that phrase that you've probably seen yourself, basically with a picture of a sign in some park, national park or something, like "Don't feed the bears," right? Because then they're going to become reliant on. You could point that sign out to any human being, no matter where they align on the political spectrum, right? They would all get the gist of that message. Well, weirdly, they don't know how to translate that or make that applicable in the human realm as well. It's like, it's no different, right? Yes, of course. And people are going to be opportunistic, right? I mean, working, being responsible, doing all those different, they can be hard in terms of like the requirements that it places on us and the strains on us. But once again, what I can't help but think of is it that these people have never even had the opportunity to be just productive people in society, and to try to find ways to flourish with themselves and to live by merit and accomplishments, because all it would take is one example of that for a person to realize that I like the idea of having self-esteem, of having self-worth, of something that brings meaning in my life, because I don't know how the victim thing, unless it's like it's hooked up to you intravenously, where you're constant fed like that. And it seems like, I guess that's the only way they keep this going, is you're just constantly reinforcing it and feeding that in micro doses on a continued basis, because I can't help but think that most people would be willing and very much capable of breaking free from that kind of mindset, if only just given half of the chance. So once again, I don't know what keeps so many people, what has caused their psychology, their mental anguish. Is it a lot of, I also maybe let me run this by you, are maybe a lot of the things that are keeping people subdued and not as many people speaking up? Is it possibly, we've always had lots of distractions and vices, but is it possible that some of these, what are they called? Those antidepressant pills, which seem to be quite pronounced and prominent that people are taking these days. Are these things, having a dramatic effect on the mindset of these people?
Absolutely. But, it's deeper than that, right? Look, I can only speak in reference to my own timeline, but, in the 1990s, when political correctness arrived, what happened? Well, we started telling people it was okay to be weak, right? We started telling people, hey, if you're weak, you're just weak, then just accept it. You're perfect the way you are. There is no room for improvement. You just are what you are, blah, right? Yeah. And that just went on and on and on. So, well, when these young people were in their teens, in their early 20s, and they hadn't ever struggled, they hadn't ever met a challenge that they had to persevere through. Of course, as soon as they start meeting real life challenges, they're going to get depressed, right? Because they weren't prepared for the world they were entering.
Right.
So yeah, of course. It definitely plays a role, but it goes way back earlier than that. It has to do with, being told that it's okay to lose, and look, it is okay to lose. Yes. But it's not okay to lose and give up. It means you go back and you work harder and you practice and you get better at what you do. With my own children, I tell them, look, you're going to lose a lot. You're going to get your butt kicked a lot. But the difference between a winner and a loser is not the actual act of winning or losing. It's who loses and goes back to the gym. And for me, I've been boxing for 30 years of my life. You go back to the gym, you hit the bag, you spar, you get in there, you get busy, you rough out you smooth out the rough edges. And you can apply that to everything. But we stopped doing that. We started telling kids it's okay to be weak. It's okay to give up. It's okay to it's okay. You're perfect the way you are. You're a shining star. So of course, yeah, they entered the real world and they got depressed because the world isn't built that way. That's just not reality. And so the antidepressants and stimulants and all sorts of shit that we're pumping to this day, pumping into kids and other human beings. It has to do with being told that it's okay to be weak. Right. And look, I'm not disputing that there's some people who require those medications. I'm not saying that. But what I'm saying is that the root of the problem goes way back even further. Right. It's not just, oh, you're depressed, here's a pill. No, you're depressed because you weren't handed the tools to navigate life. Yeah. And again, I think that's a cultural problem. And it's one that's grown over time. And now here we are. We're in a generation of weak people.
Well, listen, another question I wanted to ask, and thanks for all these great answers, because you're doing a great bang up job here. But another thing I wanted to ask about is you basically tied into two, and I kind of see where that happens, but I'd rather give you the chance to explain the whole feminism, third wave feminism thing, and then this other movement that happened subsequent to the Black Lives Matter thing that was based on some of the police brutality and violence that had happened in the States and stuff, and kind of just let the audience know how you kind of see how those two movements, the similarities that they may have shared, and kind of things that you figure that might line them politically.
Well, they're just two tentacles of the same monster, right? They're both outgrowths of postmodern neo-Marxism. Black Lives Matter was born out of critical race theory. Critical race theory is a legal and political theory that was developed in the 1980s, mostly attributed to a man named Derek Bell. Right. And really, essentially, what it does is it does the same thing to Black people, is it places them on the oppression grid. It victimizes them as well. And basically it's based on the idea that there's a conspiracy of white supremacy that exists in Western culture and is designed specifically to attack, destroy, and eliminate Black people and culture from society. They're outgrowths of the same idea, right? They're again, it's just another checkpoint on the postmodern intersectional diagram, right? They're just another point on the oppression grid, right? And again, say for example, if you're a Black woman, well, now you're a Black woman. You have two oppression checkpoints on that grid, right? So you can see how it works. If you're a Black lesbian woman, then you have 3 checkpoints on the grid, and so you're higher up in scale in terms of your status as a victim. So you see how this works, right? If you're interested in being a victim, the more, it's kind of like a point system, right? The more checkpoints you hit, the more oppression points you have, the more the world has to stop and bend over backwards at your every whim. So critical race theory was really born out of that, Black Lives Matter was really born out of critical race theory, and critical race theory is just, again, it's another insane philosophy that basically says every interaction that we have is predicated on power and race dynamics, right? And that's really what postmodernism is. It's really what it boils down to is a philosophy that every interaction, every human interaction is about power and the acquisition of power, right? So when that's not true at all. It's not even remotely true. But when you look at human existence through that lens, then it's easy to see how Black people are victims, women are victims, gay and lesbian people are victims. Because if it's all about power, then historically they haven't had any, right? If you look at it through that lens, right? And so you're the enemy, according to that philosophy. The straight white male is the enemy.
There we go. We're back.
We're back. Where did you lose me?
No, it was only like a couple seconds, but actually while you were talking there, it actually got me thinking. So this is something that actually, once again, I just can't help but another observation based on, and it come to my head while I was reading your great post on X. And I just thought of it again is, so once again, what I find so absolutely strange about this and how it seems like there are a lot of voices, even whether you're talking about, women or in the Black communities, that are obviously being suppressed for the sake of this singularity kind of a narrative. Because if you actually genuinely believe in critical race theory and this whole systemic racism, right? Well, systemic, right? Once again, let's figure the meanings of our words here, folks, right? They have defined meanings. So systemic would mean the system, right? The institutions of the state, right? Government, right? So this is the problem, and yet you want to use that organization, that thing, right? that's been oppressing you, and you're going to somehow, or you're going to falsely believe that you're going to take over the reins, and what you're going to use that now to create a different class of people are now the victims. And once again, when you're talking about the Black Lives Matter thing, which is once again, and it's kind of going back to what I was talking about in terms of the feminists, especially the third wave. What I find strange is growing up, in my parents' generation, the baby boomers, sure, there were a few, right, Black people that were. Now let's talk about, when you're talking about, major, figures, whether it's in movies, music, or all these big cultural drivers, right, that or have achieved or attained some amount of success. Heck, even in the business world, right? Now, to be in the top 1% or 0.1%, that's a small minority, regardless of your race or what's between your legs, right? So you're already, right, part of the elite to reach or attain that. But myself, once again, growing up in the 80s and the 90s, well, the 70s, I was quite young then. I was born in the 70s, but the 70s, 80s, 90s, what I watched and observed is a lot of people from the Black community. There was a much larger representation of people from the Black community in all areas and aspects of business or culture and all these things. So once again, I find it so strange that once you have seemingly, in comparison contrast to history or the past, have achieved or attained, a large portion of the goals that you're striving for, and that's the ideal time now to claim to be in the most victimized, oppressed people. That is what I find so absolutely strange, and why I can't help but think that there's a lot of people out there that maybe just kind of go along to get along, but would be more than willing to kind of give an opposing view. And I've actually heard it. I mean, there's quite a few people that actually push back against this stuff. I'm sure you're familiar with the one guy that comes off the top of my head is Zuby. He talks about stuff like this all, and I mean, once again, I find it so strange, but as you're aware of, and you pointed out and articulated earlier, is these people that are trying to control them. And I think what they're doing at the end of the day are trying to infantilize the minds of the people, right? And that's where that victim culture comes, because it's much easier to internalize that victim mindset if your brain is still functioning at an adolescent type of level, right? Whereas if you've given yourself the time and your mind the time to like evolve and expand and get to the point where you're actually matured enough, this stuff it would fall on deaf ears as far as I'm concerned. So there's a lot of coordinated and concerted effort to try to keep, whether it's the Black community, people in the Black community, or women, or anyone else that's in the First Nations, LGBT, to keep these people squarely in the mindset that they're always and forever going to be victims. And I really hope and pray, and I think you're right in your assessment, that a lot of people are waking up that fact is, wait a minute, your rhetoric, I've listened to it long enough, and in reality, the only thing that I can recognize when I look up is actually it's your boot that's on my head. It's not the opponents or these people, these terrible others, right, that you keep referencing, in particular right wingers or whatever. No, I'm actually acknowledging and seeing, and my vision is becoming clear and clear on a daily basis that no, it's your boot that is firmly standing on my head. And it's about time that I stood up, and took account for myself rather than relying on this victim mentality. And I really hope with people like yourself and all the many other people out there that are articulating their thoughts and talking about this issue in such a articulate manner, that people will get to that point. And because I think that's really what needs to take place, is for us to find our common ground, or to be able to live harmoniously with each other. And that's not to suggest where there's ever going to be any utopia. There's always going to be, pitfalls, errors, and bad deeds that'll happen to human beings. But like I say, to create the concept where you're always and forever going to be a victim, I can't imagine anything worse that I could do to another human being, right?
Yeah, well, it's the most racist and sexist label that you could put on anybody, right?
Right.
And I mean, look at what's happening in the United States. The Black and the Mexican vote is swinging overwhelmingly toward Trump. Yeah. Why? Well, look, historically, it always goes this way, right? You have you look at I don't know. Let's go back to China. You look at the nationalist government. China, people don't know this, but China was a very liberal country before the communists, right? They had a lot of Western universities. They were, freely discussing Western ideas, Western philosophies. And the nationalists, yeah, I mean, like with any government, there's always going to be an underclass. There are always going to be people who are underserved by their government, right? So what happens is, here comes the communists with Mao, and they tell all these people, hey, if you join us, we're going to take care of you, right? Well, look at what happened in Canada and the United States. It's the same deal, right? You have these governments that lean toward the radical left end of the spectrum. Their message is always the same. Hey, we're going to take care of you. Hey, we're going to lift you up. We have all these people in poverty. We need to get these people out of poverty. We have all these people who are being systemically targeted. We're going to end that. We're going to give everybody, we're going to create an equal system. People jump on board, right? Because yeah, there's suffering in the world. Like you said, it's the way the world is.
Right.
But what happens over time is people realize that they were being used, that their cause was being used, their race or their gender or their sexual preferences were being used as political cudgels. And now look at what's happening in the States. Like I said, you have Donald Trump is the clear runaway favorite, and the guy closest to him is Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who's very similar in a lot of ways. Look at Canada. We have Pierre Poilievre, who is, I mean, I don't anything short of black magic. It's nothing is getting in the way of him being our next prime minister. I think we all kind of know that's coming. Well, what's happened here is that, yeah, people like me who traditionally considered themselves liberals are swinging toward the conservative end of the spectrum, because we realize, I mean, I realized a long time ago, but a lot of people now are waking up and realizing that they were lied to, that they were used, right? That they were political tools for these ideologues to slowly increase and gain power and gain strength. And that's where we are now. That's where we sit. So, you know, when you ask like how these people are okay with being victims and you know, the government perceiving the government as the enemy, while at the same time, you know, relying on the government, well, it's because they were told that this state would be different. And what they realized with this was that the state that they supported and they got behind was much worse than the one they had previously.
Right. Well, at the risk of sounding alarmist here, I will just say this to you: is I get that and I see it, and actually it's a little something I'm getting a little bit uncomfortable about, and I'll just bring it up there now, because I do see a lot of people, and it's mostly and predominantly because the most vocal voices that actually are having the outstretched effect on the discourse are people today that identify as conservatives. Whereas I got to tell you, man, and this is absolute fact, libertarians have been dealing with this stuff for a long time. And I tell you, bar none, typically they find themselves, usually it doesn't take very long, right? Even if they have disagreements, once they've had information presented to them, where the thoughts are it just makes sense, they usually get there pretty quickly. But what I'm seeing today is that shift, but I think that pendulum may very well, and I'm a little bit fearful of this. Now, in the meantime, like I say, yes, we can all benefit from that shift, at least as the pendulum's swinging. But conservatives are not the answer, I can tell you that, because the reason why conservatives today are predominantly aligning with libertarians, who once again are the ones that are primarily the most staunch advocates of liberty, right, is that the conservatives have seemingly been pushed to the back of the bus in most of the institutions. So they now perceive of themselves as they need to align somewhere because they're not in the dominant position. But I'm not fully convinced that if the conservatives were not in the dominant position in the way that progressives are today, that we still wouldn't have a different kind. Now, it'd be a tweaking of a different kind of authoritarian collectivism, just like communism, socialism, fascism, Nazism, all different forms of collectivism. Mm-hmm. I don't doubt for a minute that kind of stuff would rear its ugly head once again. And I think now I'm not against conservatives, and I'm not against being opportunistic in some way. And at least if we're going to travel in the same general vicinity, because we're on everything's so far left, at least we're headed towards that, like, let's say right or conservative. I would just suggest to you that maybe at least when it gets to the point where their rhetoric is no longer matching up with their reality as well, as maybe that's about time that you not necessarily have to part ways entirely, but at least, keep them at an arm's stretch distance, right? Because I firmly believe that if humanity, if we're going to advance, evolve, and adapt beyond like the old world way of doing things and revolutions and stuff, if we're going to evolve, through the intellect and mature intellectually in terms of what we understand is freedom, it has to be based on principles, not. And I get, well, there's principles to either side, but you'll find with conservatives, the same with liberals, is you're going to find areas where they're not consistent or at least universal in their morals or ethics, right? They both typically want to use the state as a means to their end. Of course, once again, and I'm not against, I'm a realist too. So I'm not, and I'm pragmatic. Listen, the guy that will only beat you 2 times instead of 10, of course, I'm going to prefer the guy that's only going to beat me 2 times. But I do worry that, and especially when I think about in the long term, future historians writing books of the conservatives, right, are the ones that changed. But like I say, I don't want the old establishment to be replaced by the new establishment. The new establishment is very much similar, just tweaked a little bit than the old establishment. I guess that would be my primary concern. So for sure, listen to the conservatives, the pundits, all that. But just once again, I will point out that it's been the libertarians who are philosophically and intellectually honest and consistent, almost to a degree that you put them on the spectrum, right?
to a fault. Yeah. And look,
Yeah.
most libertarians historically have found themselves on the right, right? Because libertarianism is closer to conservatism than it is liberalism, right? Look, the godfather of modern libertarianism, Ron Paul, I mean, he ran as a Republican. In my opinion, I think one of the great tragedies of American history was that Ron Paul was not elected president. I think had he have been elected president in the United States, the world would be in a very different place right now. I think the main mistake that libertarians make is that your ideas at times are too high concept, and it needs to be distilled down into something that most people can understand. And I think what most people aren't aware of is that a lot of us find ourselves politically homeless, like myself, and we tend to, what we don't know is that most of us are libertarians in essence now. Right. And I think that's the opportunity that libertarians need to seize on. I think if libertarians had somebody like a Ron Paul, who's extremely educated, I mean, genius level, brilliant, but could explain libertarianism in plain English and the common threads and the ways that people can identify with it, I think most people would identify as libertarians. I mean, I know myself, I identify as more as libertarian now than anything. Now I'll tell you my concern. My concern is that we have culturally and politically swung so far to the left for the last, almost 15 years. My fear is that the pendulum is going to swing too far to the right.
Yeah.
And when you swing too far to the right, you get the exact same thing that we have now. Right. And I do see a huge opportunity for libertarians to seize on here, because I think the libertarian message is one that speaks to everybody right now. But again, it's just a matter of the way that the message is packaged and the way that it's explained, because I think libertarianism scares certain people, right? Because when you reduce the state to almost nothing, I think people do get kind of freaked out about that. But again, I think it's just a matter of explaining it in a way that makes sense, and that explaining it in a way that relates to people's pre-existing principles and values.
Yeah. Well, actually, I'm glad you brought that up, because, and I was talking with another guest I was talking with just the other day, and we're going to have further discussion. His name Daniel. Actually, he was on with me and Tim Mullen there. We were talking about the Javier Milei, his win, and actually with you having a liberal background, this is a thing, because I have always found, and of course there's outliers, exceptions, and all that stuff, but I find most people that come from the left or the liberal side of things are much more, and me, someone like myself, yes, and the libertarians that you're referencing, very analytical, very, cut and dry, like you say, perfection to a fault in terms of articulating the philosophy of liberty. But that's not what inspires or emboldens people. And this is the part where I think that we're libertarians and conservatives. Hey, Ben Shapiro's trying his hand at it, although I'm sure he's had to hire some people that maybe aren't as staunchly conservative, because it doesn't seem to be as not to suggest conservatives can't be as creative or artistic. But like I say, when I grew up, when I think of, I come from a religious family, very religious family on my mother's side predominantly. And then, of course, I went through my journey in terms of learning philosophy and libertarian philosophy and thought, even later in life. But I got to tell you, and all these things have been great, but I got to tell you, a lot of the things that informed me in a way that I didn't have to sit down to a 2-hour or 3-hour lecture or read Rothbard or Mises or anything. Once again, I go back to the movies and televisions, and those things growing up, in particular in the 80s and 90s, the ethics of libertarianism, and of course this was Hollywood. This would have been, I consider Hollywood was very much, at least somewhat leaning towards at least limited minarchist government, libertarian light, you know what I mean, kind of scenarios, right? There was still a lot left room for the state, but those things were major influences, not just on me. And yeah, whereas today, no matter what generation or demographic you're talking, there's a small subsection or cohort of our society that wants to go and sit and watch Jordan Peterson for 3 hours, right? But almost everyone, and particularly the young people, are the ones that you really got to reach, will on a regular basis, they'll binge watch, right? Whether it's Netflix or going out to the movies or do this. So if we could get people, whether they're part of the liberty movement, doesn't matter if you're conservative or not, but this is, once again, this is where the left kind of have it in spades, is their ability to tell stories and to put those stories to a screen or to music. And those things, like I say, you don't have to go and sit and listen to a 3-hour podcast, like I said, although I definitely recommend it, and especially if you're listening to Jason's, right? For sure. The Brave New Normal, by the way, yeah, or mine for that matter. But once again, I think this is an area where we could fill a big, huge gap. And like I say, I don't care where you identify on the political spectrum or in terms of your philosophical mindset or thinking, is yes, we need some cultural drivers, to take center stage in our countries and start to focus on getting these kind of ideas to all the people in different form. Because once again, we're finding the people like you or I that are susceptible to getting this message in this manner, right? And we're fairly good size cohort ourselves, and seems like our numbers are even increasing. But I firmly believe we could reach a whole lot more people if, once again, we had the kind of creative minds. And this is the thing about libertarians, because a lot of them do historically come from the left, right? They do have that creative gene, it seems, in them. So I do see that this is something where, and conservatives, and this was something I was refreshing my memory about in terms of Milton Friedman. I forget who was mentioning it, but basically he was the one that said, this whole idea, this experiment that America is sparing of liberty, well, in terms of the capitalists, yes, go out and make as much money as you can, based on offering a product or a need or a service through voluntary means in exchange. But if you want to keep this state, this human experiment of the United States, which is not built on your identity in terms of your geography, but based on ideas, and those ideas of liberty, then you need to support, and this is something that I'll suggest and point out to anyone that's listening now, especially if you're in the business community and maybe have saved up some capital, is, now is the time to invest in the kind of people like your Jasons here, or even myself. I'll just add that, but anyone else out there, like, once again, I'm not greedy. Anybody, you pick whoever it is, but help support them financially to be able to get this kind of message across in a multitude of ways. Because I firmly believe, whoops, hold on there. There we go. Sorry about that.
I'm still here. I'm still here.
I firmly believe that those things are going to greatly contribute to hastening the pace in terms of getting more people on board. Because, as you've probably heard many times before, is culture, like downstreams is generally, politics is downstream of culture. So if we can get as many different cultural drivers on the same baseline in terms of promoting liberty, individual freedom, liberty, personal responsibility, all those things that you and I hold dear, then I think we would be that much quicker to get into that place where I think all of us want to be. What are your thoughts?
Yeah. Well, I think you do have those cultural drivers. Joe Rogan is a libertarian, right?
Unfortunately, he's American though. We Canada.
Yeah, well, Canada. Okay, I mean, Canada is a different monster.
Yes,
the problem with Canada, again, and it goes back to apathy, right? We're very culturally influenced by the United States,
right?
And so, if you talk politics with most Canadians, they're more aware of what's happening in America than they are in their own country, right? And that's kind of always been the story. Yeah. And in terms of a strong libertarian candidate or strong libertarian voices here in Canada, I mean, how many strong voices are there, period? Right? Like, I mean, think about it. Like, how many podcasts and writers are there in Canada? I mean, in terms of Canadian writers that I follow, there's Rex Murphy, and that's that, right? and I can't think, and I would say Rex Murphy politically tends to be more libertarian than anything else. And so we do have those cultural drivers, but again, like, that's why I'm here. That's why I relaunched
Yeah.
my podcast, because I
Yeah.
realized, oh, I have a pretty sizable following with my writing. Okay,
Yep.
well, let's turn the microphones on. I'm still working on articulating my thoughts,
Right.
speaking them, because when you're writing, it's different. You have the ability to sit and kind of distill things down and etch out what you're trying to say. Whereas when you're speaking, it's just all coming out at once. But
Exactly.
I think too, it's just, the problem with the PPC is that they haven't been very good at promoting themselves. Sorry, I have a sunlight coming in through my window here. The problem with the PPC is that they haven't been good at promoting themselves. And the Maxime Bernier, as much as I like him, I think that he doesn't do a very good job of relating to people and explaining himself to people in a way that makes sense.
Yeah.
Right. And I think the PPC would be well served to have to bring in a new leader with Maxime Bernier as a consultant, right? And that's just my opinion. It's not that I don't like him. I personally like him. I like what he has to say. The other thing that I don't like about the PPC is that it does tend to attract some people with some very questionable perspectives and opinions on things like race and religion and you know what I mean?
Yeah.
We've seen it. I've seen it online. And I'm like, that's just not doing, that doesn't do the libertarian cause any favors.
Terrible.
Right.
Terrible.
And the views and opinions that I see reflected in some of these people who have the PPC, banner in their profile photo is not a libertarian perspective at all. It's more of a fascist sort of perspective. So there's also that. It's I think libertarianism, especially as it relates to Canada, has to define itself.
Yeah.
And I think that's another big challenge is how do you define it? I mean, myself personally, I view myself as more libertarian and centrist than anything. But how do you define that? How do you define it? It's hard. It's difficult. So I think it's finding the right person or people to step forward and explain the set of principles and values that libertarian stands for in a right and responsible way.
Yeah. Well, the reason why I bring up in terms of the culture drivers, and once again, I'm really appreciative of you for what you're doing out there, and I hope that other people tend to support you, and maybe even you get inspired to undertake even more ventures, and once again get support. And I will be right here as well to support you in any way that I can. But my concern, I guess, the reason why I'm more concerned with Canadian-oriented content is obviously because of all these bills that the Trudeau Liberals have passed. Because for now at the very least, and of course for those of us who are somewhat tech savvy, there are workarounds. But I am a bit concerned about some of these bills that have been passed that are going to make it profoundly more difficult as time goes by. Because you got to remember the CRTC is still kind of working through this stuff, right? Is in terms of how much of that external influence, that great American influence. And once again, I attribute the majority actually of those who heavily influenced my mind in terms of where I'm at today would be American personalities and typically libertarians, like you say. Well, Ron Paul, I mean, he's right up there number one in terms of when I first started learning about this stuff. But once again, if we do get to a point where a lot of that content is greatly suppressed for most, except for those of us who are, like I say, you got like VPNs and, key scram, you got all kinds of ways and workarounds, right? But for the average Canadian is, like I say, I don't want to rely solely on, or even primarily on the Americans, although I have leaned on them many times and I will continue going forward. But I would really genuinely like to see, because that's one thing I've noticed about Canada in particular, and I acknowledge we're just individuals, so Canada isn't a monolith. But people in this place that we call Canada, typically, especially for the size of the population, per capita, tend to punch quite above our weight in terms of what we can bring to the table. And we're talking, whether you're talking about sports or whether you're talking about actors or music personalities. Typically, of course, historically, the ones that have become genuinely successful have had to, unfortunately, always traveled to the United States to achieve or attain that. But once again, I feel that what that does to the human psyche is you're still always going to be the little brother. I would like to see Canadians stand a little bit more firmly on our own feet and have some actual genuine influence, like I say, from people like you or others, and like some actual support, some backing, so that once again we don't have to travel thousands of miles or cross an international border to get our voice out there and amplified. I would like to see that happen here in Canada, and regardless of where, whether it's on the East Coast or the West Coast, I guess it's neither here nor there. Maybe a little representation from all areas, right? I would love to be able to see that, because I don't want to always and forever rely on the American experiment, their constitution, their understanding of liberty and fundamental rights and freedoms. I want Canadians to kind of mature and adapt that kind of mentality for them and source that here at home.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think, but I think historically, our major cultural drivers have always been American, right? And now, you know, you talk about our cultural drivers in a political sense. Yeah, Joe Rogan and well, we do have Jordan Peterson. I mean, he is a major driver, right? And so, but Jordan Peterson only really gained notoriety through appearing on American media channels, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
It's always the same story, and the problem with Canada is that we don't have faith in our own people. And that's always been whether you're a musician or you make films or you're a writer or podcaster. I mean, for me, what happened for me was all organic, and it's strange because awesome. I am a very rare anomaly, right? Most Canadian writers, if they want to have any type of notoriety, they have to write for an American publication, right? We have potentially the best investigative journalist in the world, period, right here in our own country, a man by the name of Sam Cooper. Well, he's not getting any traction, and he's one of the, or talk about Andy Lee. I mean, she's another one of the best investigative journalists alive today, and they're both Canadian, and they both, I just said two names that I'm thinking that I would imagine 99% of the people listening right now have never heard before. Well, why is that? Well, we have a very difficult time promoting and supporting our own, because we're always looking south. We're always looking to the United States for what's happening there, right? And when you see a Canadian come up through that American pipeline, we view it as being a stamp of approval, right? So unfortunately, that's the way it is. And I've always been puzzled by that, and I've always thought about how do we change that? But I don't think it can be changed, because so much of our cultural influence comes from the United States. I would love for it to be different. I would love for us to be able to build. Look, I lived in Los Angeles for 5 years, right? I was in the belly for a long time. I saw how the machine works. I was inside of it. And I'm telling you, like, the way that things grow organically in the United States, it all happens at a community level first. Yeah. Right? Canadians, we have a very distorted perception of the way things work. They think that things just magically arrive, but they don't. It all starts at a community level and then grows outward from there. And Americans have a very, very good grasp on that concept, right? Yeah. Whether you're talking film, whether you're talking music, any creative endeavors, anything really, they understand that it takes people to support it and to really push it forward in order for it to grow beyond its current limitations, right? Yeah. And we just don't get that. We just don't understand that, because again, so much of what of our culture is runoff from the United States. We think it just magically happens, and that's been the great disconnect for Canadians, and why nothing great really comes out of Canada without some level of American involvement. I mean, even look at Trailer Park Boys. They're probably aside from Jordan Peterson, they're probably the greatest cultural force to come out of Canada of the last 20 years. Well, they only really gained any notoriety in Canada once American producers signed on to produce the show. And realistically speaking, they didn't need American producers. They could have done it on their own, but they needed that American stamp of approval in order to get the CBC and Showcase involved. Right.
Well, like I say, hopefully, well, I mean, we do, and we will have, I mean, the other option there, I suppose, is we just become the 51st state, and then we don't have to worry about this whole thing. I'm joking.
Yeah, well, I will say this to you. I read history a lot, and I've asked a few people about this on my podcast, and I've had varying answers. But we are in a very critical point in our country, not just in Canada, but in the United States. And historically, at the end of every empire, what happens is the empire breaks into separate states and separate nations are formed.
Yeah.
And we are beginning to see that in both Canada and the United States. I mean, today, the Alberta, the Danielle Smith government have just invoked the Sovereignty Act.
Yeah.
Saskatchewan is moving toward its own independence. And so we could very likely see in the next, I think we are closer to seeing a dissolution of our Canadian Confederation than we have ever been before. And if we don't see any drastic changes in the next couple of years, I could foresee a scenario in 10 to 15 years where we do have a series of independent states that have created alliances across that border.
Right. Well, I could see that happening as well. Anyways, I really appreciate you coming on and having this discussion with me. I figure I might as well, rather than keep you too long here, because I probably want to get it the opportunity, because you have such great writing, and I'm going to go through some of your other writing, and I definitely recommend anyone else who's watching the live stream to go and definitely check out your writing. But before I do, I just want to maybe get your last or some final thoughts in terms of not just this letter, but anything else you want to bring up. And then we'll tie this up. And like I say, we'll get back to doing what we do. You go finish doing your writing, and I'll get back to promoting the content. And like I say, we'll talk again. But just if you want to just tie this stream up with some final thoughts in terms of this whole identity politics, this wokeism, and how it's going to play out, or what you would like to see going forward.
Yeah, I guess my final thoughts. I mean, I spoke on this earlier, but I think it's the most important message that I could put out there right now. Don't be a victim. Don't allow yourself to be victimized, no matter who you are, no matter what your challenges are in life. Look, I'm a Métis kid that came from a single mom. I grew up poor as poor can be. I mean, we were $5 away from living in a car for most of the early years of my life, right? So, just don't be a victim. The moment you accept victimhood is the moment that you accept enslavement. Don't be a slave. Don't comply. Follow your heart, follow your instinct. I think that's the main missing piece right now, is that we've forgotten how to listen to ourselves and to listen to our gut. If something doesn't feel right, it isn't. If you think you're being lied to, you are. So just listen to your instinct and follow your heart and just be strong and be ready to fight, because there's a fight coming. We're not even in the first round yet. And for everybody out there listening, just be ready, because it's coming.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Jason. And once again, I'm going to have the link to your Substack. I'm going to have your link to your X. And I definitely, once again, recommend that you folks follow Jason, because, like I say, great writing, a great voice of reason out there. And we're desperate in need of voices like Jason. So support him. And that's, once again, that's an area that, really resonates me when you were bringing up the whole Canadian support and Canadians. And I'm going to, like I typically do, is lead by example, and I'm going to support you, Jason, and do whatever I can going forward. And you feel free to reach out to me anytime you want. And we'll all get through this eventually in one way. And like I say, I firmly believe, some days I can be pessimistic, but on most days I'm optimistic to the fact that I believe good will ultimately win out. Common sense will prevail. It's just that we're going through the time where it's hard to see, the tree for the woods, but it will get there eventually, folks. And when it does, it'll be as a consequence of the tireless and relentless efforts of those of us who are willing to pursue these ideas and ideals, even in the face of the onslaught of those who are desperate to continue to economically and socially enslave us. So thanks again, Jason. You have yourself a great day, my friend.
Thank you for having me.
Libertarian, and I love liberty.